Welcome back to our second half of this Patanjali class this morning. Let's just say a very short prayer, invoking the Master's presence. Divine Mother, great Masters, saints and sages, we open our hearts to Thee. Help us to attune ourselves to Thy blessings. Enter in and take charge of our lives. Om Shanti. Now Asha's going to pick up a little bit where she left off this morning, but I thought what I would do before we started again, and this actually has an ulterior purpose of allowing the latecomers to arrive, is I would like to ask you to contribute and ask you, what point do you remember Asha making this morning? Sometimes we come to these classes and say, oh, it was so great. What did she say? What are you going to take away? What point? Is there any point she said that you can take away?
If we fall out of
Okay, stand up. What do you say?
If we fall out of attunement, it's our fault.
It's not her fault. If we fall out of attunement, or you could expand that beyond just attunement, but whose fault is it? It's his fault. He made me suffer. You know, it's his fault. Or he made whatever the situation is. Well, somebody is an instrument for these things, God's work in this world. But ultimately, how we react is in our hands. And now this is actually something that is empowering to us, because we realize it is in our hands. It's in our hands to choose. And as long as we have that ability, that ability to choose in life, you could say is a very human quality. It's a powerful tool, and it's that thing that is going to give us the ability ultimately to choose to go in the right way, or perhaps to choose to go in the wrong way. We're always faced with that in every situation in life, that choice. Which way am I going to face? And then we might say that's one of the very few, or if perhaps the only choice that we have in life, is which way am I going to react when something happens. So that's very good. That's one thing to remember. It's in our hands. It's our fault if we choose to go in the wrong way. Now, any other point that she made? Okay, it's okay. I'll come back this way. Here, say so everybody hears.
Okay, so you've fallen out of attunement and you're suffering. Get over it.
Get over it. Okay, get over it. And that was a popular one, Asha. I think that point. Okay. Now, that's that's 1A and 1B. Another one. Any other point that she made?
Do not identify.
Stand up and say. Everybody can hear.
Do not identify yourself with the things.
Don't identify. Identity. We're in this world. Patanjali is saying. What is he saying? He says we're identifying. What are we choosing? You could say to identify with. We're choosing to identify with this ego, this body, this personality, these qualities that we have. Thoughts, I'll interject a little something that went with that. Thoughts are universally rooted, and we are attuning to certain thoughts at perhaps the expense of other thoughts that we could choose. And so we identify and that identity is ultimately what we choose to identify with is going to affect how we should suffer, perhaps might suffer in this world, the things that we identify with. So good, very good. Now, what else? Blesi.
Start with the right attitude to reach the right consciousness.
Start with the right attitude. Start with the right attitude. Did you say that?
That was an inference.
That was the inference. That's right. That was the inference. you know, sometimes what a person says and then what a person hears, sometimes, you know, there's a winding thread that connects those two. Okay, that's very good, very good. Any more that Asha made, points that Asha made this morning that struck you?
I think one thing which struck me very much is that when we make efforts and use these tools to go reach higher levels of consciousness, it's not that we are going there. It's basically we are attuning ourselves, and then the consciousness is already there. Like masters, they're already in that consciousness.
Yes.
We are just attuning ourselves to that level.
That's what, tuning ourselves to that level. And if you read Patanjali in the third pada, you'll see he gives these examples. If you attune with this, if you tune with that, you know, it may be 15, 20 examples of things that we potentially can attune with. And that's just a taste, of course, because it's infinite, depending upon what we choose. So very good. So, okay. Any other points? Okay, well, no, I got you first. I'll come back to you, though. I'll come back. First, I'll get others with first times. Anything you remember? Come on. Are you going to say you're going to? Okay, come on. You could, Sergio.
The importance of valid authority.
Excellent. She made this point 2 or 3 times. Actually, came back to it. Made it strongly. Came back to it. The importance of valid authority. Now, does anybody remember the 2 others? Okay,
Direct perception and inference from direct.
Yeah, direct perception, inference, and valid authority are ways of knowing, of ultimately knowing truth, you might say, or being able to discriminate between this and that, which is the correct or the higher, better way to go. Very good. That's a good one. Any others? Okay, Angela, somebody's pointing at you, but maybe
God is simple.
God is simple. God is simple. Very good. That was, Asha spoke quite a bit about that one. That's good. God is simple. And okay, any more? Okay, now you get your second shot. This is the second time around now.
Since God is simple, the Patanjali is also a simple book, and in 4 stages. First comes Samadhi, then the path, then the obstacles.
Yeah.
And 1 minute.
Very good. So God is simple. God is simple. Excellent. These are all extremely good points. So now as we're going to go into the second half of our class today, let's try to pick out those points, because when we go from this class in the days ahead, one, I would recommend you read the book. Read the book. Or more than read the book, study the book. Study the book, take time and study it. But then take the points that, the ones that, the special points, maybe the ones that resonate with you. Take those points and then meditate on them. And then relate them. How do they apply to your life? How do they apply to your circumstances? Perhaps something in your recent past, came up to you. Like I think the one we started with of it's your responsibility to take charge of your own life, how you choose to react to life. That's obviously a good one for all of us to take. But any of these points, take them, think about them, and then study. And you'll find that there's a wealth that she is only touching the surface of, that are below the surface of this. So with that preface, I'm going to give this back to Asha, and to be able, she can take it from here and lead us.
Thank you, John. That was very instructive. It's deeply gratifying.
Now you know.
Yeah, now I know what I said. That he doesn't give you a lot of time. Although it was interesting, I touched on that at the end of the class, talking about how this is really the convergence of one never thinks of Patanjali as being warm and encouraging, because it is flat. But this book is extremely warm and encouraging, just what John said, which is a kind of contradiction of thinking of Sri Yukteswar and how stern we imagine him to be, even to the point where you may remember Swami Kriyananda said to Master once, "Oh, when I look in Sri Yukteswar's picture, I see so much love in his eyes." And Master actually said to Swami, "There was no love in those eyes." I mean, Master actually was very human and he joked. He had a very good sense of humor. So, to what extent he meant that literally. But still, Sri Yukteswar says the end point of all the spiritual path is without love you can't take one step forward, even though he was a jnana yogi. So it's a very interesting combination in this book to feel the extreme austerity, even just the austerity of the expression of Patanjali's sutras, then balanced by Swamiji telling us what those sutras mean in just the way I described earlier. I don't have to repeat it, but how all the elements come together. Bhakti and wisdom really come together at the same time, and it's really fascinating that way. When Somesh remarked that about if you fall out of tune, it's your fault, I just wanted to add a little, I'm not going to soften the thought. That you have to really realize that self-realization is not for the faint-hearted. This is not a comfortable teaching. And if you really have the courage to look at it, it's very austere. You don't have to always, let me phrase it in the right way. There's a great temptation sometimes, if you think that the teaching is too high, to just pretend that the teaching is actually not asking that of you. That this is what it says, but not really. This is something else. But it's very important not to do that, to be able to say, this is actually what it says, but this is where I am in relationship to it. I'm going to talk about the question of sexuality for just a moment without really talking about it. But in recent years, Swami Kriyananda has been much more frank in both his writing and his speaking about the need, get over it energy, just really strong. He never used to talk about it that much in the early years when I was younger. And but recently he's just sort of felt, why mince words? Let's really talk about where it fits in life and where it fits in the spiritual path, which is not really. At the same time, he was last summer at Spiritual Renewal Week at Ananda. He got on this theme and he just spoke the truth, the simple, straight words that are out of the scripture, that in the end we must transcend all physical imperatives, we must transcend all identification with our body. So, of course, sexuality has to be transcended. It's just self-evident. And he gave it with a great deal of force. And then this girl, this young woman who was born and raised at Ananda, who is 28 and lovely and living a completely different life, bless her, she had the absolute courage and confidence in Swami. In front of 400 people, she stood up and said, "Is sex bad?" And he looked at her. He called her by name. I won't. He called her by name. He says, "Oh, don't even worry about it." That's what he said to her. "This is not your teaching," is what he was saying. "This is the true teaching, but don't think about it. It's not your teaching." And I really think the most challenging aspect of the spiritual path is to have the nerve, the courage, to really understand what's being asked of us and to not flinch from the power of what's being asked of us, and at the same time be comfortable enough in our own self-worth and in our relationship to God and Guru to say that's a true teaching, but it's not my teaching right now. And when it is, I'll know it. And in the meantime, let me focus on what I can focus on. And that dance is actually far more important than you realize. Many people think the dance is to force yourself into the whatever it is. But nothing in nature responds to that. When you push too hard, things break. If you want to direct a tree in a certain way, our friend, remember Steve Weber, used to have all these bonsais just beautiful bonsais. He was fantastic at them. And he had some really old ones where you'd taken, like I went to a garden show once where they had lots of bonsais, like this big, but it was like a 200-year-old oak tree. And it had they were magnificent, all of the characteristics of a gigantic tree, but only this big. But all of the professionals who talk about that, you have to do that very carefully. You have to direct it in such a way that the life force remains strong. And you don't make haste by rushing. I mean, you don't make progress by making haste on the spiritual path. And the ability to just be where we are is also, it really comes down to trusting that God loves us. It's an interesting interrelationship when you really think about it, that I don't have to earn God's love, I already have it. And inasmuch as I am already loved, I just have to do what I have to do. You can think about it in children. If children are insecure about the love of their parents, they're always desperately trying to be something. They're trying to guess what they're supposed to be. And they're trying to form themselves into some imaginary idea of what's going to please the parent, and it gets very, very complicated. It's exactly the same with us and the divine. So even as stern and magnificent as Patanjali's teachings are, you have to also realize I can only get there. I can only get there from where I'm standing, and the only way I can make progress is one step at a time. And if this is the best that I can do, God's just going to have to put up with me. And earlier this afternoon, we were having a question and answer session and talking, and I was just talking about some of the things that I've been through, and it's like we just all go through it. It just doesn't mean anything. But still, we're absolutely responsible. And you see how you can put it all together and how easy it is then if you're not frightened about your present reality, which is what we really have to work on. Love casts out fear. In the presence of perfect love, there is no fear. And if there's fear, then to that extent we don't love. That was the first spiritual principle I learned. It's always meant a lot to me. But what I was also going to say about him saying it's our fault, there is such a thing as fact, and there is such a thing as truth. And one of the ways to help us not get confused is facts are facts, but sometimes facts are not relevant because facts do not always tell the truth. That's the example, and I think I made that point when my friend came to me and he explained to me how everybody was wrong, and he had all his facts right. Every one of his facts was accurate, but they did not add up to the truth. And the reason for that is, once again, we don't want to get ourselves into fuzzy-mindedness, where we're always just trying to sort of put on an attitude. We need to be able, and Patanjali says this repeatedly in so many different ways, we have to perceive what's really happening, but then we have to draw the right conclusions from it. And it doesn't hurt, and it's not judgmental to say, my, he's really projecting on me a tremendous number of his own realities, isn't he? And wasn't that fellow completely emotionally out of control? And did you ever see anyone so deluded as that person? That's not judgment. That's just the facts. But what you do with it after that, whether you respond kindly, whether you respond angrily, whether you self-justify, that's where the keys are. Because we shouldn't become stupid on the spiritual path. And we shouldn't become disconnected from what we can really see. Does that make sense to everyone? These are very important points. So, now, are there any other questions? Jai was asking for impressions and ideas. Or do we have any questions about anything that might not have been clear or that you would like me to say more about before I go forward? You don't have to have any questions. I liked the first aphorism of the second book. And it says this: accepting pain as purification, study of the scriptures and introspection, openness to the divine will and guidance, and acceptance of them, these constitute the practice of yoga. In 1986, I mentioned to you just in passing that that was the first time I came to India, and we brought a group of Americans on a pilgrimage in the footsteps of Yogananda. Now Daya and Keshava carry on all that work. And the first time 4 of us came as leaders of this trip to India, only one of us had been to India before. David, we decided this just was a good idea. We just sort of decided it in our living room. It just seemed like a good idea that this would be a good service. Very few of our community had been to India at that point. And my husband David had been once before. And we just thought it would work if we did this, and in fact it did. So he came across to India again and with a travel agent, figured out the whole trip, and then he came back and told us about it, and he got me and Durga and Vidura. And so the 4 of us came across, and only one of us had any idea what we were doing, but we're a quick study, so we would sort of, get a few basic facts, and then we would turn around and present them with great authority, which we're pretty good at, so we pulled it off. And then, as I said, we did that same trip about 12 times, and most of the time, we brought 35, one year we brought 50 people, and almost all were Americans. Almost all were coming to India for the first time. And for many of them, it was the first time they'd really been out of what were the euphemisms, the developed world or the wealth of the West. They'd just never seen a really different culture like this. And many people from America have a certain fear of traveling in India because it just seems so unusual to them. It never was part of my reality. But one of the things that people are afraid of is the sight of poverty. Because we're such a wealthy country and we see so little poverty, they're afraid of the sight of poverty. And, this is a land of contrasts. I mean, that's putting it mildly. It's a cliche. Those first years, remember we stayed, because also in those years, there weren't as many middle-tier hotels. There were really high-level hotels, and then there were very inexpensive hotels, and we really didn't think we could bring these Americans to the inexpensive, so we did the 5-star tour of India, which was great, So we were at the Oberoi Hotel in Calcutta, which was a little less expensive than it is now. Everything, of course, has escalated here. It was still pretty pricey, but not quite like now. And some of our people were in a room, and then down below, they could watch on the sidewalk the life of the family that lived on the sidewalk below their room, which was more luxurious than most of them had ever been in their life, simultaneously watching this family, conduct their life in the 4 square yards that was their home down there. Now, it was very interesting to me how people with a complete unity of non-experience, they were all the same, had such different reactions to being besieged by beggars, by seeing families living on the street, just all the things that are just, part of life here. This is the way the world is here. It's the way it is. It's massively shifted from 1986, but nonetheless. And after doing these trips for a few years, and my job was usually to counsel and just keep everybody happy. Pilgrimage is not vacation. Pilgrimage is a spiritual experience, and so it was not without crisis. And that's how I earned my bread and butter in my room in the Oberoi Hotel, was just sort of doing all this. But I began to see this very interesting pattern emerge. Some people absolutely, the word I want to use is a very slang word, freaked out at a beggar coming up to the taxi, or a mother holding a child, trying to persuade you that her child was starving unless you emptied her wallet into her basket, and or watching the family carry on their life on the sidewalk. They just could hardly stand it. I want to go home. I don't want to be here anymore. They just didn't know what to do. Other people would just enter right into the spirit of it as if they had lived here all their lives, and they would behave completely appropriately. There would be just not the slightest ripple in their consciousness. They would just seem to know exactly what to do. The pattern I began to see was a very interesting one. People who understood that sometimes we have to learn through suffering. The people who understood it in their own lives, that sometimes that which seems painful actually brings me something that I really want to have. We're not upset watching other people go through what might be painful experiences. And those who were still in a state of intense rebellion at the very idea that they would be asked to go through painful experiences became very upset when they had to see anybody else going through painful experiences. So when I picked up Patanjali, you always like it when the masters affirm your own theories, don't you? You know, and he puts it right here. This is the chapter called The Way to Samadhi. The first aphorism says, accepting pain as purification. And we can be as rebellious as we want about it. I know that you all hear the Festival of Light, the long Festival of Light that Swami Kriyananda has written. You hear it at least sometimes. I don't think you hear it as often as we do in America, because we follow we've kind of modeled our services on American church services, so we have a Sunday morning and every time we do the ritual. There's a little story in there, which is the story about a fledgling bird who has to go out into the world, and he goes through 4 stages of spiritual development. And it's an allegory for the soul and its journey. The first stage, when we're thrown out, is that God says to us, you are on a divine mission. You are my child, and you will expand your consciousness, you will flourish, you will multiply, and then everything you have you will share with everyone, and won't it be a wonderful creation? And alas, I'll quote the festival exactly, alas, we abandoned our mission. And we thought, what else is wisdom if not to keep what is mine for myself? Which is a very convenient line to remember, because you can say, when you want your own way, or to be selfish, you can say, as it says in the Festival of Light, what else is wisdom except to keep what is mine for myself? Very useful, very important to know this. And then it says, it was enjoying its self-expression, and it began to think, the more of me I have, the better off I'll be. And so it entered the second stage of the spiritual journey, that stage which is called the revolt. And the revolt is when divine law is a certain way, but I've decided that it's going to be different. And then I'm going to live my life not in accordance with divine law, but in accordance with what I've decided is right. What else is wisdom if not to keep what is mine for myself? And then, even though repeatedly the little bird lost everything it had, it clings to the idea that this is really the way things should be. And it says in the festival, an afternoon of the bird's life was like eons of our time. And slowly by slowly, as you say here, slowly by slowly, the bird suffered enough that it came out of that state of rebellion, of revolt, and it entered the third stage, which is not understanding, but the quest. And at the stage of the quest, we're no longer so certain that we ourselves actually have this all figured out. We don't really know the answer, but we have become interested in knowing the answer, which you see as an enormous step forward. Now, most of us teeter right between the quest and the revolt. The fourth stage is the stage of the masters, the redemption, in which we understand that our only purpose is to serve and there is no self anymore. But mostly we teeter between the revolt and the quest. And on this question of suffering and the purpose of suffering and why things happen the way they are, that is really the cutting edge between these two realities. Because insofar as God gives us certain circumstances in our lives and our response is, why are you doing this? Then to that extent we just trap ourselves in that stage, because God can't answer that question when it's asked in that tone of voice. Because the reason He's sending it to you is because you can ask that question in that tone of voice, so it simply can't be answered. You can ask exactly the same question. God, why are you sending this to me? And then you have shifted from the revolt into the quest. And we can spend as long as we like being very upset about suffering. And to be upset about other people's suffering is really no different than being upset about your own. It looks better. Oh, it's not I that I'm worried about, it's you, it's them, it's the world, it's the poverty-stricken, it's the starving children. And I saw something so funny. Let me think what this was. It was a video on YouTube that somebody sent me. And it was, let me get it right. Yes, it was a group of African young people, you know, that were always sending money to the starving children of Africa. And so a bunch of African young people, and it was fabulous. They did this whole YouTube, and they said, they have heard that their children freezing in the cold weather of Norway. So they were sending radiators to Norway. That's what they were doing. And they had a rap song about it, and there were all these pictures of them loading all these radiators into these trucks to the poor freezing children of Norway. I loved it. I thought, you know, after a while you just want to strike back. And there was this whole thing about how they'd been informed about how cold it was in Norway, and there were pictures of snow and, you know, from their African son, how painful that felt to them, how unbearable, and how they just couldn't stand it anymore, so they were shipping radiators to Norway. Okay, that's beside the point. But sometimes you see, oh, it's not I I'm worried about, and then we get into this great existential crisis about, you know, everything in the world and how everybody is suffering. And it's one of those things, you know, like in the Gita, when Arjuna asks Krishna a question, and I'm going to paraphrase. Arjuna asks Krishna what seems to him to be a very thoughtful question. You know, isn't war a bad idea? Why would I want to kill my relatives? I mean, it all sounds really good. And the essence of what Krishna says is, those words sound really smart, but that's a really stupid question. And then he tells Arjuna that, you know, you're just being cowardly. You're acting like you're being wise, and you're just taking your cowardice and you're just putting this facade over it. You know, you have to pick up your sword and you have to fight. Of course, the real story of the Bhagavad Gita and the Mahabharata is exactly what Somaj says and what Miriam said. At a certain point, you have to take yourself in hand. And it isn't wrong to do that kind of battle. And it's symbolically family against family, but it's the question of your own personal courage or not. And that's why Krishna was so emphatic on that point. It was also a righteous war, but that's, you know, more or less incidental to this. But once we understand, usually almost always from our own experience, that merely because something is not pleasurable or easy, these are words that some of you have heard me say before, we think that good is pleasurable and easy. It's the nature of this planet. The nature of this planet, especially the country I live in, is good equals pleasurable and easy. But that's also sort of what the ego kinds of thinks, because that's what the subconscious mind tells us. If it's pleasurable, it's good. If it's easy, it's good. If it's painful, it's bad. If it's difficult, it's bad. But by what standard, toward what goal is that true? If I get to stay exactly as I am, is that like a reward? Is that a sign that God loves you? Is that you never get to learn anything because, oh, poor dear, it might make you cry. I had a relative, a distant relative, who never liked to hear her children cry, and they just grew up to be the most spoiled, helpless people, because she could never understand, you know, what it is that really gives us what we really want in this life, this inner strength. Well, what I was saying here is, this whole question of pain as purification is not just a matter of our own relationship to God. It really actually changes our relationship with the whole world. I went through a cycle of this in myself, which I'll use the example of how I learned it with my parents in the last years of their life. I learned this in several different ways. My mother My parents have been gone for at least 10 years. My mother died of Parkinson's, and Parkinson's is a pretty gruesome ailment, and she had it for about 15 years. And my father, really his health was pretty good until the end, but just before my mother passed away, he just decided he'd had enough, and he just took a little vacation. He just took a little mental vacation, and he kind of lost track a little bit of the facts of this world and retreated into his very sweet heart. And so for a couple of years, he was rather childlike, and he didn't remember much, and he was in transition. But when all that saga began to evolve, as you can all imagine, it's not easy to see people go through realities like that. And I became, I'm a very executive person. And as someone said about me, I'm very good in other people's crises. I can move in and take charge of their crises and just manage them to perfection. And so I kind of moved in on my parents, and I started managing their reality, which they didn't appreciate in a way that was a little surprising to me. And I was exhausting myself managing their crisis. And finally, I had to stand way back. And I realized their karma frightened the socks off of me. I was just really afraid of their karma. Well, several things happened at the same time. First, I realized it's not my karma, it's their karma. And naturally, it seemed a little odd to me because somewhere in my mind, I was thinking that I would be standing here and then I would turn around and I would be flipped completely into the life that they were living. And there was naturally a huge disconnect. But I realized for them, they've been walking inch by inch for incarnations into this exact spot. That where they are right now was the perfect culmination of all of this life and all the lifetimes that have gone before, because that's how it works. Just to put a little sideline in here, 10 years into this, my mother, who was a good woman, but a little spoiled, that's the word I want to use, a little willful, a little bit weak-willed, she looked at me like this. I hate to admit it, but this disease has been the best thing that ever happened to me. Because it gave her a little gumption and it gave her a spine, and she died a lot better than she would have died. Honestly, how can I say it if it hadn't happened? Pain as purification. And it was a god-awful experience for all of us, really it was. But it took her where she needed to go. Okay, back to where I was saying. So I'm thinking about my parents, and first of all, I realized it's their karma. It doesn't seem so weird to them. When you're in the Oberoi Hotel, if you ever are in the Oberoi Hotel, and you've come from California, and you're looking down at this family here, you're imagining, or they were imagining, what would happen if just flip, they were living on the sidewalk. They wouldn't have any idea how to deal with it, and it would seem so alien to them. But for the family living there, it's the culmination of incarnations of effort to get to that point. It was the perfectly natural next step for them. Now, if it was positive or negative, easy, pleasurable, any of those things, that's a whole different question. But there was nothing wrong with it. It was the inevitable result and the appropriate result of where they are and where they need to go. And then I had this extremely peculiar and very helpful thought about my parents, to go back to my parents, that I really wasn't afraid, or I don't want to be presumptuous. I don't think fearfully of what might happen to me. I don't sit around and think, oh, what if I run out of money? What if I have a disease? What if my husband dies? What if I get kicked out of Ananda? Whatever it might be. I'm not one who fantasizes fears. And as a general principle, I feel pretty confident that if God sends it to me, He's going to send me the means to deal with it. I may not be pleasurable or easy, but I have faith that if God sends it to me, I'll be able to handle it. And I realized that I have confidence in myself. And then I realized, wow, what an insult to my parents. That I think that I can handle my own karma, but they can't possibly handle theirs. I have to run in and run their lives for them. And I thought, there's something really off, really profoundly off here. And then I watched in a lot of areas of my life where, oddly, the desire to help was not really the desire to help. The desire was to expunge from my world the fearful image of other people having to deal with their own lives. I mean, whoa, where does that thought come from? And it's all right there in Patanjali. The way out of delusion is to understand pain as purification. And look at this whole planet. You know, sometimes spiritual people get criticized because we're not frantic about the state of the planet. But among the other reasons, many reasons we're not frantic, including the fact that God is in charge, so what is there to worry about, is the fact that everybody's just doing what they need to do. They wouldn't have incarnated into those conditions if those conditions weren't ideal for them. I mean, now that is a challenging teaching. That is a real challenging teaching. I was with Swami Kriyananda Jaya, you were probably there. I'm looking, who else? Sadhana Devi would have been there. In 1978, 79, Swami Kriyananda gave a program he called Superconscious Living, and it was held at the Palace of Fine Arts in San Francisco, which is a big, a very fine public auditorium. It was this whole system about the spiritual life, a beautiful teaching that he gave. And he was just in the mood to challenge people. And he said, right into this room, there were 1,000 people in the room, he was talking about the law of karma, how absolutely true it is, and how there's just no mistakes in the law of karma. And then he said, the Jews in the concentration camp deserved what happened to them. The room exploded. I mean, people couldn't contain themselves. They were like this, they just couldn't stand it. And then he went on to talk about what the word deserve means. Deserve doesn't necessarily mean punishment. Oh, he was promoted. He really deserves to be promoted, doesn't he? He got that award. If I've ever met anyone who deserved that award, that was him. Now, I don't know how many people walked out at that point, but if it's true anywhere, it's true everywhere. God's will doesn't have holes in it. He makes no mistakes. And this is challenging. You can still raise your hand and ask Swamiji, is sex really bad? And he says, don't worry about it, right? You can still say, okay, but not yet for me. But still, it's out there and it has to be thought about. I grew up in a Jewish family, so this is something that I was born in 1947, right at the end of the Second World War. This is something I know really well. I love Swamiji, and I love how bold he is, and I don't have a identification with being Jewish, and I definitely don't have a reactiveness to defend the Jews like many ethnic groups defend themselves. So when he said that, I didn't actually laugh because it really wasn't appropriate to laugh. But I thought, wow, that was something. Look at that. Look what he just did. Many years later, I was somewhere and I was visiting an Episcopal priest friend, and he was part of a Jewish-Christian dialogue group, and he thought it would be so much fun to bring his Jewish yogi friend to his Jewish-Christian dialogue group, and so we went there. And because I'm Jewish, I can say this: Jews love to try to make non-Jews understand about what happened to them in Hitler's Germany. It's just extremely essential, and that seems to be where you have to start. So they were passing out these different readings, and one rabbi said, the years under Hitler and that time in the concentration camp was the shining hour of the Jewish people. Because the essence of our teaching, and Judaism is Sanatan Dharma, it's just wandered off a little bit, but the primary prayer of Judaism is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. The meaning of that teaching is there is no other reality except the divine. Most of the rabbis don't know that, but that's the facts. I went to a High Holy Day service with my father once, and the rabbi was teaching out of this prayer book, and he was so boring and so uninformed. And I'm turning this prayer book, and there's so much great stuff in there. Almost irresistibly, I was going to go up and say, could I have the microphone for just a couple of minutes? But some part of me knew that wasn't going to work. But this rabbi who wrote for this piece of paper, he got it. He said it was our shining hour. because everything was taken away from us and we had the opportunity to prove what we know to be true, that there is only one reality, and that reality is the divine. Exquisite. Isn't that just exquisite? I'm in this group. I try to get anybody in the group to pay attention to this passage. Not a chance. I don't know who passed it out, but they just, nobody could go there. It all had to be about all this angst and, you know, we have to make it up to you somehow and we must swear this will never happen again. All just painfully helpless affirmation. You know, that's if you can't accept that we learn when we're challenged, and everybody learns when they're challenged, and therefore challenge is a gift, not a punishment. That's the first line of the first step of the second book of Patanjali. Because until you can get that, you'll always be in the stage called the revolt. And how useful is it to just rebel against what is? We just go in circles, completely in circles. And the universe doesn't care what we think. It just is what it is. And when we finally get into the quest, and we begin to say, okay, you know, purification through pain, so how can I cooperate with this? And elsewhere in the Festival of Light, it says, whereas in the past, speaking of Kali Yuga, suffering and sorrow was the coin of man's redemption. This is all philosophy put in very poetic forms. In other words, and this is especially a Christian tradition, where the image of Christ could have been the resurrected Christ, but they preferred the crucified Christ. So instead of seeing him triumphant, we see him just before he triumphed. I went with Swamiji once through the Uffizi in Florence, and the modern art was not attractive to us, so we went mostly to the older art, which was enormously about Jesus and enormously about him being crucified. We walked out of there, and Swami, in his inimitable way, just said, I think it's time for a new theme, he said. I think we've taken that about as far as it can go. And then he writes, whereas in the past, suffering and sorrow were the coin of man's redemption. So see, this is our own thought form. This isn't just Christianity. Christianity is just a very big symbol of the consciousness of Kali Yuga. That somehow we have to suffer. Or I should put it differently, that when things are not pleasurable or easy, we have to feel bad. Whereas in the past, suffering and sorrow was the coin of our redemption. We bought our freedom with our suffering, right? Now, that payment has been exchanged. And then the phrase is for calm, acceptance, and joy. And so it's just telling us, yes, you know, painful experiences are the way to purification, and here's the way to solve them. Calm acceptance and joy. You know, because we know, or let me phrase it differently, when we finally understand that this is only happening to me for my greater good, that the degree to which I feel that something is being inflicted on me is the definition of my limitations. And why would I want to keep them? Some very sort of pop art philosopher said very simply, the prize for defending your limitations is you get to keep them. Like, what is that point about? And weeping and wailing when things happen, and wishing they were different, and lining up the facts, and missing the truth, is just being in the revolt, which we can be in as long as we want. It's eons of our time. And nobody suffers but us. And we can rail against the injustice of the world and all of that. But sooner or later we come to this understanding. And then when we have that fundamental point down, then we're suddenly cooperating. You see the difference? If you're in a river, I don't know how many of you ever swum in rivers here, probably you had a chance, or in an ocean, and you get caught in a current, or you're trying to swim back against the current. I mean, you just work so hard to go nowhere. But as soon as you start going with the current, same strokes just give you so much reality, so much movement, so much energy. So, in what Somesh put it, whenever I'm out of tune, it's my fault. The other way to put it is, whenever I don't feel well, I must be out of tune. Swamiji makes that statement somewhere else, that all failure is the result of lack of attunement. So whenever it's not working, I'm dissonant somewhere. And as you practice on the spiritual path, you get actually very sensitive to it. You just can feel there's a little dissonance here. And instead of looking for it outwardly, you just stand back. Where is my attunement? Not quite so. And as Jaya was saying, it's extremely empowering. And we ask ourselves, am I in rebellion? Am I confusing facts with truth? And then after he says, accepting pain is purification, he says, study of the scriptures and introspection. The scriptures in this case are, what is meant by that is, the scriptures are often the link to the consciousness of the masters. Because it's not the words that are really our uplifting section, but the scriptures unite us with the masters. I never finish my thought about the Christian Bible and how people in America who are very fanatical on it you'll see them everywhere, and they're always reading the Bible, and their Bible's all marked and worn out, and my restless mind thinks, gosh, I need something else sometime. But sometimes when my mind has been still enough, and it's really about my mind, not about the Bible, I'll just suddenly start reading the Bible, words I've read many times in my life. And they become the link to the consciousness of Jesus. And then it's Satchidananda, ever new, ever existing, ever new bliss. And it's, how could I ever be bored reading these words over and over again? But then he also adds to it, he says, study of the scriptures and introspection. Because everything begins with our understanding how we ourselves fit into this. And he adds, and this comes after the phrases like direct perception, inference, and valid spiritual authority. Because really introspection is impossible if we're only by ourselves. There's an odd characteristic of devotees which I find interesting. Well, let me think about that. I'll see what God says to me, they'll say. And they might be sitting right in front of someone who's just told them what God thinks about it perfectly clearly. But we have this idea that God will only speak about me to me, and that somehow God can't speak to anyone else accurately about me. Whereas the chances are pretty good he'll speak more accurately about you to someone else. Because our prejudices are just so great. It's just so hard. Every time I see this face, which I've lived with for 65 years, it startles me a little bit. Isn't that odd? I think partly after I come to India, I think it's the wrong color. I think I need to be looking more like you guys. I don't know if I was African or Indian, but I don't think I've been this very often because it looks really odd to me. But when I look at it, I think, how many other aspects of myself that I'm with every day are unfamiliar to me because I'm so close to them and all of our prejudices. I'm going to go back to valid spiritual authority for a minute. During our afternoon session, we were talking a lot about the power of community. I think it's absolutely essential on the spiritual path to form friendships with people whose impersonal wisdom you trust. I'm not talking about blind obedience, and I'm not talking about surrendering your own capacity to reflect upon your own life. But I know for a certainty that if I hadn't grown up where I grew up spiritually, and I point to Jaya, Haridas, Jyotish, Seva, Devi, others, who I just grew up with. And it wasn't as if I was under obedience to any of them, or that any of them, well, Seva said I have to do it, so I do it, kind of thing like that. But I was always in a choir, is how I would put it. I'm a mediocre singer. I know the alto parts to some of the songs. As long as Duty stays on the alto part, I can sing them. The minute she moves over to the soprano, I go silent. I haven't the foggiest idea where the notes are. I just lose it completely. And I feel, in a very real sense, spiritually speaking, we need to be operating in a choir. And even our introspection needs to be, to a certain extent, shared. You just test your ideas. And he says, study the scriptures. He speaks of valid authority. Don't think that somebody has to be God realized in order to know a little bit that can help you. You know, sometimes we think only a perfect master can help me. Nobody can tell me anything but Swamiji. And of course, you can't ask Swamiji, so conveniently, nobody can tell you anything. Wow, that one worked. That was a really good one, right? We used to, in the early years of Ananda, when people didn't have any idea who Swami was, they would disregard him because Master was a perfect master, but Swamiji never claimed to be a perfect master, so therefore he had nothing to teach. You know, he couldn't teach me anything, because how do you know? My answer to that was in those days, well, the difference between me and Swamiji is really obvious to me. The difference between Swamiji and Master I really can't discern so well, so when I can tell the difference, I'll worry about it. But until then, I'll try to close the gap between us. And you don't have to have even someone around you who's terrifically advanced. It can be somebody who you feel even as a peer, but somebody who can help you. This is what I'm thinking. Does this make sense to you? Because God can use any instrument. And what I found among my Guru Bhais, especially with introspection, is that I could really, they all knew a lot more about me than I knew. And they were just waiting for me to ask a lot of the time. My friend Seva, with whom I was we were twins for like about a decade. I used to just cogitate all the time in this really unproductive way. And she was a very different type, and we'd be walking along and she would say, "You're doing it again, stop it." What? You know, she could just tell in my face that I was just spinning my wheels inside my head. But we had made friends like that. I really encourage you not only to introspect, but make friends with people who can help you. Don't bore your friends with endless stories about yourself. But when you have a thought, test it. Test it in the choir. See if you're still singing the right part. I'm thinking of doing this. How does it sound to you? It seems to me that this is what's trying to happen. What do you think? And don't take it mindlessly, but don't revolt against it. Be in the stage of the quest. Okay, this is difficult. I don't quite get it. Help me with this. And how does it relate? And what does it mean? You'll find that you can just make so much more spiritual progress in that way. And also, Swamiji, not often, but on occasions, in public settings, he would just talk about people. Things, just talk about their foibles or their strengths or what they were going through. And oh my God, people used to just, I'll use the word again, freak out, And his response was, what's so private about it? I learned this from a wonderful Indian man. His name, we called him Sri N. Keshava, and his address was first mayor of Bangalore. He was actually the first mayor of Bangalore after independence. And he was a dedicated disciple of Swami Kriyananda in 1962, in that era. And then when Swamiji was extracted from India by SRF and not allowed to come back, and everybody lost connection with him, Mr. Sri N. Keshava, as we called him, he lost track of him. And 10, 15 years later, it was somewhere in the 70s, so about 15 years later, somehow his sister in the United States saw Swami Kriyananda's name and remembered the connection. So he came to America, and he came to see Swami Kriyananda after all these years, and he felt Swami was his guru. He'd been initiated by him, and Swami had vaporized off the face of the earth as far as he was concerned. It was then I said to Swamiji, how those people that you left behind must have suffered. And actually Swami's eyes filled with tears. He said that was absolutely the worst of the whole experience. He said, what happened to me was, I could live with that, but what happened to all those people, he said that was the worst of it, because they were relying on him, and he was just pulled away from them. So Mr. Keshava, Sri Keshava, I became his charioteer, actually, because I drove him all over, and I was his host, and he kind of adopted me as a daughter. He was considerably older than I. And he came into my kutir. I had lived in a little kutir, and there was the spiritual journal, the SRF spiritual diary, which I read every day, but I never wrote in. Very, very rarely wrote in. He walked over and he picked it up. And he starts looking and he says, "You should be writing in this. Why are you not writing in this?" And he found a few entries and then he read them, and then he went on like this. Just, on one level, a complete invasion of my privacy, but on the other level, it was just so innocent. Here we were. So I just let that pass. I was completely unfamiliar with Indian customs. I thought maybe he was just, who knows? I didn't know what to think. And I didn't really care because I didn't really write in the book, so it didn't matter. So then later, I'm taking him over to see Swami Kriyananda, and Swami's house was over the hill and in a different area. So he's going to see Swami after 15 years. I knew, intensely emotional. So I took him to the front door and I said, "Well, I think I'll leave you alone with Swamiji." He looked at me. He said, "We're Guru Bhais. What possible secrets could there be between us?" And then he just swept me right into the house, and I just witnessed this, the tears and the full prostration and, everything. It was quite something. I mean, he's a very dignified man, and he saw Swami. He stretched himself out and wrapped his hands around Swami's ankles and just wept at his feet, and Swami just wept too. I mean, he represented all of that misery all at the same time, and I just had to stand there. But think about how much time we spend protecting ourselves. And if we protect ourselves from others, we're also protecting ourselves from ourselves. Self-justification, it's all through here. I just haven't pulled out those slokas. Self-justification is our worst enemy. And fear of being revealed, fear of being exposed, and then we can't even expose ourselves to ourselves. And so part of the way we practice is, not everyone can take it. Some people you shouldn't tell your faults to because they will use them against you. But take the trouble to cultivate real spiritual friends. It'll save your life. In those moments, one of my friends said to me once, "Why didn't you tell me?" Because she made a terrible mistake. I smiled at her so sweetly and said, "Honey, I did." I just put my arm around it. It's all right, There we are. All right. Then after it says, openness to the divine will and guidance. And then it adds a second phrase, and acceptance of them. It's like two parts. It's not only that we have to be attuned enough to really feel God's will in our life. When He presents it, we have to be willing to accept it. Where does that take us back to? It takes us back to the revolt. I remember once when the community, it was in a pretty chaotic state, and we were all trying to guess, all kinds of things that we later came to actually understand. Someone said to Swamiji once, "How can you tell if something is your dharma to do?" And Swami answered, "Well, if it needs to be done and you're next in line." That's how he put it. We wanted this huge personal answer about it. And so often people in their lives, let me think about this. This is a story in the book I wrote about Swamiji, but I'll repeat it here. I was in a situation where I thought I had a decision to make. It was a very difficult decision about a personal situation in my life, and I had the impression that I needed to make a decision. And I wanted to be appropriate. I wanted to do what God wanted, but no matter how I prayed, and I was quite dramatic in those days, I prayed dramatically. I felt I got no answers from God as to what I should do. And I went to see Swamiji, and he was just finishing talking to someone else, and that woman had had her heart broken by some cad of a man that she had loved, and he had deserted her, and she was extremely sad. And he was being so sympathetic to her. She was weeping. He was like a perfect father, just comforting her like this. And I thought, wow, I've caught him on a great day. I was really looking forward to it, So she finished her story and went out, and it was my turn to talk to him. And he was sitting on a chair, and there was an ottoman, a hassock in front, and then I sat on the floor. And I started telling Swamiji all the conditions that I was working with and how passionately I was trying to know God's will and how no matter what I did, God didn't answer. And finally, I was so overcome, I actually threw my head down on the hassock on my arm and I began to sob like that. And then I lifted my tear-soaked face and said, it's so hard to know what God wants, you know, drama queen, like way out there. Swami was sitting sort of like this, you know, just totally unmoved, just watching me give my little performance. When I cried out, it's so hard to know what God wants, Swami said, no, it's not. And that was pretty much the end of the interview. Like no comfort, you know, patting on the head, no explanations. It was like pretty over at that point. And I, you know, tried to coax a little more out of it, but nothing was coming. So I went home. And I realized that at first what I thought he would said was, it's not hard for him to know why am I having so much trouble. That was sort of what I tried to think I heard, because that was really great, because after all, Swami can know, but who am I? That was a wonderful way to get out of it. But I realized, no, that's not what he said. I said it was hard to know God's will. He said it wasn't hard. So I centered myself in meditation and I said, well, it's really hard for me to know. If it's not hard, but it's hard for me, that means it must be my fault. So instead of saying, what shall I do, Lord, what shall I do? I said, why is it so hard for me to know? And the answer, I then had this fabulous dialogue, which I think was actually a dialogue with Swamiji, but I was alone. The voice said, because you really don't want to know. You're pretending because it makes you look good, but you don't want to know. And then I said, why don't I want to know? Well, because you're afraid of the answer. You're afraid of the answer because purification comes through pain. And I knew perfectly well what God wanted, I just didn't like it. So as long as I could pretend I didn't know, I could just play out this great thing of being completely sincere, but I didn't have to face anything. But I got really interested. What am I afraid of? You know, you're afraid that you're going to have to go down this path, which isn't the path of your choosing. Oh, I said, oh, okay. And why am I afraid of that? And then I just followed all that through. And when you start down a road like that, well, the answers get very interesting. You're no longer banging your head against a wall. You're working your way through the real issues. And that's fair. God doesn't care if you're afraid, but it's better to introspect and have friends who will tell you what's actually going on. And ever since then, whenever I feel I don't know what God's will is, I say to myself, what is blocking my knowing? You see? So we have to be open to God's will, and then we have to accept it. Because often he's speaking so loud and clearly. In my case, it was the handwriting on the wall. It was with a big felt marker. It was in bold letters. Everywhere I turned, it was written. But I was pretending that I didn't know because I didn't want to accept it, because I was afraid. So then my relationship with God is, okay, I'm afraid. Help me overcome this fear. And that's something God can really answer. He can really help you with that. I had a friend once who, Swami Kriyananda was writing a certain book, and she knew a lot about the subject, and he was giving her the manuscript, and he was wanting her to comment on the manuscript. And she was just finding all these petty flaws in what he was saying. And then she was calling me and just telling me how bad his book was and this and that, and nothing she was saying was making any sense. And I finally said to her, what are we talking about? What is going on here? And then she blurted out. She said, if he's not wrong, I'm going to have to listen to him and do what he's asking of me. I said, oh, we're talking about fear. That's no problem. Let's talk about fear. Let's stop talking about his manuscript, okay? You know, we're just creating chaos because we're not introspecting sufficiently to be open enough to God's will and then to have the courage to walk into it. And where did this all start? Because pain is often the way to purification. But it's so much more painful It's just infinitely more painful to insist on our limitations than it is to surrender them. And sooner or later, that thought gets in your mind. Oh, calm acceptance and joy. Whereas in the past, the coin of our redemption was pain and suffering, that payment has been exchanged now for calm acceptance and joy. And I move from revolt against the lessons that God is sending me to a calm acceptance of them. And then eventually joy. Calm acceptance is a great phrase. Because there you are. It's just, this is what's happening. I'm just going to deal with it because this is what is. And we go from the revolt to the quest, and we go from the quest to the realization. And that's one aphorism of Patanjali, just right there. So you can see we have a lifetime of study and delight here. And I think that's the end of the story, unless there's a question or a thought that someone else wants to share. Anything else? All right. Thank you all very much. It's been really a joy.